Well, hello again, everybody. We are now having the lecture number 9, which is the looking at the European study of the Chinese canon. This is really a fairly complex story of how in the world the people in Europe found out about Buddhism. Once they found out about it, how did they make the distinction between the Buddhism they found in India and that they found in China? And then beyond that, how did they come to know about the huge Buddhist canon that was in the Chinese language? And how did they begin to study it? So as I say, pretty complex. Basically, what we're looking at is the fact that the question of communication across Eurasia was the dominant question for the study of Chinese material in Europe. Europe was a long way from China across the vastness of the Eurasia landmass. And for centuries, people in Europe really had no knowledge of what was Eurasia. They had no knowledge of Eurasia, I guess I'd have to say, and they had no idea of what was taking place culturally beyond Baghdad. It was a blank to them. And it was a very hard blank to fill in. In the medieval period, there was a document discovered that claimed to be a letter from a Christian ruler out there somewhere beyond Baghdad, asking for help because he was under attack by anti-Christian forces. Nobody knew where that was, how to get to him. People were still looking for this. When they did finally make trips to the eastern part of Eurasia from Europe. So it was a big issue to get the communication link in place between that rather small extension of Eurasia, which we now know to be the primary core of our cultural sphere. The first ones to begin to understand that there was a reality out there in the East, and to even understand some of the cultural patterns that were there, came when the Russian Empire extended itself all the way through Siberia. They were, as we've seen before, coming in contact with Tibetan Buddhism and Mongolian Buddhism. They did very little with Chinese material. China was still a kind of distant, unknown entity, even to the Russian Empire, which you see extended and touched on the Chinese empire at points. But it was still left to try to figure out how China was going to be part of any kind of study. Then came the colonial period. The colonial period, as you can see, this remarkable period in many ways, when Western Europe, those small countries, dominated vast areas of the Earth's surface. And at one time or another, as you can see from this map, those European colonial powers held dominion over the whole of North America, the whole of South America, the whole of even Africa in one sense, and then spread into South and Southeast Asia. This colonial period is one that we will discuss because the colonial period really broke the back of the lack of communication from the eastern portion of Eurasia to Europe. People began to make regular trips to Asia. Marco Polo had helped to open this up. Marco Polo's trip indicated that there was a place called China, what we call China. There was a huge population in the eastern part of Eurasia, and they were powerful. And this was all shocking in a way to the Europeans. When we look at the map, the colonial map, you will note that it basically misses China. China remained independent. It was, from time to time, had economic, even social contacts. They let little enclaves like Macau, Hong Kong, parts of Qingdao to be occupied by Europeans. But the real connection between Europe was not with China. So as a result, we're still struggling here with how the Europeans found out enough about China and had enough knowledge and enough capacity with the language to begin the study of it, so that Sanskrit studies really thrived because the British had taken over India. The Dutch had taken over Indonesia. The French had done Vietnam, Laos. So the colonial period was there, but how did the colonial period lead to a study of the Chinese Buddhist canon rather than the Pali, the Sanskrit, and the older Russian study of Tibetan? As I've said, the British Empire, the time when they began to study the Buddhist tradition, they were naturally much more interested in the Theravada, in the Sanskrit, in the Pali, and their focus was not at all on China. And even to this day, you don't find that England is a powerhouse in Chinese studies. They have, like many of the colonial powers, they retain their interest in their old colonies. So colonial scholarship dominated the world for a long time. And as you look at this, you can see what the domination was. When the colonial period came to an end, scholarship changed dramatically. I'm old enough to have witnessed the fallout of the end of the colonial period. I, in essence, lived through it after World War II. And as the European powers withdrew their economic and their governance from Asia, this support for the study of Buddhism began to wane in many parts of Europe. So we've witnessed this rise and fall of scholarship, which was tied to economics, tied to governance, tied to the colonial period. In Buddhist studies, the British, particularly the London Polytech Society, made an enormous contribution. Rhys Davids and his wife, they became the purveyors of information about the Pali Canon. And they dedicated their lives and spent much of their effort translating, making additions, making the Pali Canon available to the world. We owe them a great debt. They worked very hard. He was a civil servant. He went to Sri Lanka as part of the colonial era. And like many civil servants, I think he didn't have enough to do. So he began to study the local culture and became fascinated with Buddhism, with the Pali material, worked at it from a linguistic point of view, as well as a meaning level. So the two of them are representatives of colonial scholarship, where the colonials were sent by the government to a place, and while they were in that place, they acquired a knowledge of the local culture, they acquired knowledge of the language, and they made a great contribution in a specific form of Buddhism as it developed. In England also was a professor, Max Mueller. He was able to introduce a whole new way of studying religions, which was to make what we now call comparative religion a real scholarly field. And he said the person who knows only one religion does not know any religion. Well, whether we agree with that or not, he was attempting to say that we have to open up to the fact that there are multiple religious traditions in the world. And it's important for us to know what they are. And it's important for us to comprehend those. Now, he had a disadvantage. He was German, and he was in England, and he was considered by many to be an outsider. And he was not really a strong advocate of the colonial enterprise. But Max Mueller was really crucial in finally beginning to bring some study of the Chinese Buddhist canon to Europe. And he did it with the most unlikely person in a way. I have a picture of Nanzhou when he was a really old man. But when he was young, he went to England. And he went there because Japan had come in contact with Sanskrit scholars, particularly from Germany. And they wanted to know what these Westerners are studying and how they study it, how they study us. So they sent Nanzhou to work with Max Müller. When he got there, he was a good student. He tried to learn everything he could from Müller about religious studies, how to study scripture, how to look at it. And I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but I can imagine one day Max Müller said to his young Japanese student, Nanzhou, we need to know much more about the Chinese Buddhist canon. And what I want is I want for you to make a catalog of it. Will you make a catalog which tells us which texts are included, something about the text, and therefore give us knowledge of this great collection of religious literature about which Müller must have had to admit to him, I know very little, about which there's almost no research. So young Nanzhou was really given a horrendous task. And he had to introduce the whole of the Chinese Buddhist canon in his work. When you look at that catalog today, it's very hard to deal with some of it because, number one, nobody knew exactly what translation or transliteration of names would be in English. We didn't have an easy listing of how do you pronounce all these Chinese words and how shall we render it in Roman letters? Nanzhou was not a native speaker of English. He was in Oxford, so he had to figure out from scratch almost, how can I write in Roman letters the names of these Buddhist texts that I only know in Chinese characters? It was a big task. But he did a surprising job. And his catalog is still worth considering and looking at. Now, he wrote that it was, and he listed it as the catalog for the Ming Dynasty. That he was dealing with the Ming Dynasty in his catalog. And that leads us to another rather complex story, which I now will proceed to, which carries with it the weight of how the communication between China and Europe was taking place. So with Nanzhou trying his best, we have to go back and look at the history of how people studied Chinese tradition before. One of the really pioneers of anything to do in Europe with China was the Jesuit scholar Matteo Ricci, 16th and 17th century. Ricci went to China and he visited emperor. He carried with him his training, which was in mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and he loved to do maps. So when he got to China, he tried to explain to the emperor the world as he knew it in a map. And he drew a map of Eurasia. But when he presented it to the emperor said, this map cannot be correct. China is the central kingdom. You put it up here way off to the right. It should be in the center. Well, Ritchie was a very clever person, and he agreed. He redrew the map. He put China in the center. He came from the Vatican. He was there to convert them to Christianity, particularly to Catholicism. And he worked hard at it. So he decided that the way to get the Chinese to really be involved with him was through his knowledge of the sciences. And he, in turn, decided to make Christianity a kind of Confucian tradition. He was very leery of Buddhism. So he dressed like a Confucian gentleman, and he presented to the Chinese the study of Christianity from a Confucian point of view. And the Chinese liked that. And he was very influential. He was like Nanzhou, an early person. He had to make a dictionary. How do you make a dictionary? He made it a Portuguese-Chinese dictionary. That meant he had to learn the characters. He had to learn how they were pronounced in Chinese. He had to know their meaning, and then he had to translate them into Portuguese. And he had to devise a system whereby he could Romanize each character's sound. So it began an era which was to influence Buddhism for a long time. I showed you a minute ago the Rhys Davids representing the colonial period as colonials. But there was also the fact that what opened up the study of China to the world was religious. It was missionaries. Missionaries and colonials each played their role, but it was missionaries who did so much for it. The missionary era in China is said to be from 1807 to 1947. By 1947, China was going into its period of having a communist government, and religion was to be downplayed as it was. The first Protestant missionary who entered China was in 1807. And after that, they've now counted 50,000 missionaries from Europe, North America, went to China during that century and a half. And they left an enormous influence on China. And it was an influence which was very hard for Buddhism because, of course, they rejected Buddhism and they were trying, like Ritchie, to prove to the Chinese that the Christian religion was superior. Well, after Morrison had set up Protestant missions in China, there came a missionary, Samuel Beal. And Beal was really the first scholar. He was trained at Oxford. He was a Methodist minister, but Beal began to look into the Chinese literature. He began to deal with Chinese Buddhist material, and he was really the first one to understand basically what a Chinese Buddhist text was like. And he translated, and he worked out a whole system of study and translation. I think he was not always in good odor with the rest of the missionary community, because they would say, Samuel, why are you doing all this work with those Buddhist materials? We're trying to get rid of this religion and replace it with our Christianity. But he was a strong person, and he held his own and never made any thing of the fact that he was studying, in a sense, the enemy. But he made a great contribution because he really opened up to us the fact that now you could read in an English translation for the first time, basically, a Chinese Buddhist text or the history of Chinese Buddhism. And this leads us back to Nanzhou. So here we are back in England. Samuel Beal has now gone back to Oxford. And while he was in Oxford, a famous diplomat from Japan came, Iwakura Tomomi. Tomomi came in 1875. He was doing a world tour for the Japanese government. He was an envoy trying to establish connection between Japan and the rest of the world. And he met Samuel Beal, and they must have gotten along. Samuel talked to Tomomi, and this is a story which Zhang Wu at the University of Arizona has brought to light. Beal asked him, can you send us a copy of the Chinese Buddhist canon? We don't have one. We have few texts, we have a few manuscripts, we have some. But would you please, when you go home, send us a copy of it, the whole thing? Tomomi agreed. And when he went home, he stuck to his word. And he sent a copy, complete copy of the Chinese Buddhist canon to Beal in England. It was this copy, which was then available for Nanzhou. So when Max Mueller said to Nanzhou, make me a catalog of the Chinese Buddhist canon, Nanzhou had to have in England a copy of the Chinese Buddhist canon in order to make that dictionary, that catalog. And sure enough, this was what Nanzhou used, was the gift that came from Tomomi to Beale. So what had Tomomi sent? This is where Professor John Wu at Arizona has made clear to us now. If we read the catalog which Nanzhou produced from this, he says, I have made you a catalog of the Ming Dynasty edition. But the question was, if that's so, where did Tomomi get a copy that he could send? He's from Japan, and being in Japan, what does he have available to him? So as Wu says, what he sent was not a print from Chinese woodblocks held in Japan. What he sent was a copy of what's known as the Obaku Tetsugen Canon, which was a set of printing blocks in Japan. And the Obaku Canon has been, I think John Wu's study of it is going to really make us realize how important it was. We saw before that the Northern Sung sent their copies to the Khitan, to the Koreans. They didn't send one to Japan. It was later that the Japanese got a hold of a copy of the Ming Dynasty version of the canon, and Obaku Tetsugen canon was a carving made in Japan with that Ming Dynasty copy. So what Tomomi sent to Beale was not a Chinese copy of the canon. It was a Japanese set of printing blocks that are little known to us, have not been really studied. And that's what Nanzhou had to make his catalog to introduce to the world of the English-speaking world what is in the Chinese Buddhist canon. So I told you it's a rather complex story, that it was the Christian mission movement in China that had allowed Samuel Beale to go to China to learn Chinese, to then, because of his erudition, to go back to England and to become a professor there, to meet the Japanese envoy who came in the 19th century, to ask the envoy for a copy of the canon, which Beale would have known because he had been in China and had seen copies of block print copies of sets of the Chinese Buddhist canon. And lo and behold, the envoy sent it to him. So that much of what we began to know in the English-speaking world about the Chinese Buddhist canon came about through this incredible, in a way, incredible story of missionaries and envoys and ancient movement of texts, and finally a Japanese block print edition, which came to Nanzhou. Well, after you began to see, I think, I can't go into, detail about everything. So I will tell you though, that the study of the Chinese Buddhist canon was next picked up in the 20th century by a very famous French scholar, Louis de la Vallée-Poussin. And he was at Paris, naturally. He had begun to study Chinese. He became very interested in the Chinese Buddhist canon. He was aware of what Nanzhou had done. He was, and I think had actually seen the copy of the Obaku manuscript or block prints in England. And then the question for him was, here he is. He wants to study Chinese material. Can he get his university to support him and give enough money to allow him to have a salary to just do this? Well, again, the story is rather remarkable. There had been a rebellion in the 19th century in China called the Boxer Rebellion. And during the Boxer Rebellion, the Chinese rebels had turned against European enclaves. They burned and destroyed lots of the buildings and the structures and the equipment of these foreign enclaves, including the French. When the rebels were put down, in part with European technology and European support, they said to China, you owe us, you need to rebuild all that you've destroyed of our enclaves. And it was a huge amount of money. And so suddenly, the French envoy in China was paid retribution money for what the Boxers had destroyed. And it had to be paid in gold or silver. And the French then said, what are we going to do with this money? And they did a wonderful thing. They said, okay, the Boxer money will go to establishing the study of China, Chinese material. And Louis de la Vallée-Poussin was the first basic recipient of the grants and the awards of money from the Boxer Rebellion. And he used it very well. He was a wonderful scholar. He was able to establish in France the study of the Chinese Buddhist canon in a way which I don't think he could ever have done without that kind of money from the repayments. Among his students was Etienne Lamotte, a Catholic priest. Lamotte very early became interested in the Chinese Buddhist tradition. I've never quite understood why, but nevertheless, he did. And his father was very wealthy, and he was a diplomat and also a businessman and also an aristocrat. So Etienne Lamotte's father interestingly enough, was a friend of Edward Conze's father, Edward Conze, who did the translations of the Prajnaparamita literature. They were lifelong friends. Lamotte was at the University of Louvain in Belgium. And he was a priest. He had to teach. There were no students who were interested in studying Chinese Buddhist texts. So Etienne Lamotte had to teach Greek. He knew Greek very well. He was a linguist of great excellence. So he set his Greek class at 8 a.m. And that guaranteed that he always had a low enrollment. So at 8 a.m., he would get up and teach the few students who came to Greek. I had an encounter with Etienne Lamotte when I was starting to do my research on the Chinese Buddhist canon, and I decided that, and was my advisor recommended, that I pick up where Lamotte had apparently left off translating the great commentary to Kumarajiva's Prajnaparamita Sutra. And so I worked for a year on it. I was assuming that my advisor knew what he was talking about when he said, this is something would be nice to do. And then one day I wrote a letter to Lamotte and finally said, this is what I'm doing for my dissertation. And I got an airmail letter back. Remember, we didn't have such quick connections in those days. About a month later, that said, my dear friend, I have just finished and sent off to the printers a translation of the portion of the commentary that you were working on, which meant I had to stop. I couldn't use it, what I had worked on for a year, because you write a dissertation, it has to be something that nobody else has done. So there I was. I had to then start all over again. So Lamotte always has a major place in my life. He had very few people who were interested, but one of them was Hubert Durt. And Hubert Durt went to Japan. And some of you may follow the work that he did called the Hobogearin, where he studied the Chinese Buddhist canon in great detail. So there was a lineage of these French Belgium. Even though Lamotte was Belgium, he had studied at Paris with Vallée de la Poussin. He had all the notes and note cards that Poussin had for his research. They were left to him, so that the French study of the canon was very important. Well, back to the religious side of things. We often use in our research, when I was working, one of the great contributions was a dictionary, a Chinese English Buddhist dictionary. And it was prepared again by a missionary, Soothill. And Sudhill's dictionary is still good. It's still usable. It's been digitized. It's available. Sudhill was again, another Methodist missionary, a Protestant. He went to China, as you can see. We have a picture of him being carried. Those were the days for colonial diplomats. He was being carried through the jungle, if you will, by the natives with having long bamboo on their shoulders. But he made a great dictionary for us. So out of all of this, we have both the colonial powers, the missionary movement. Sudhill was like Beale. His missionary colleagues didn't like the fact that he was publishing books that were just dealing with Buddhism and not Christianity. But these two men were very strong in their own belief of what they were doing, and we owe them a great debt. Both of them made great contributions to the early study of the Chinese Buddhist canon. So when we look at this situation, we can see that it took a long time to get across Eurasia. And it took a long time for people, once they had gotten the idea that Eurasia had this huge landmass and that there was culture and there were texts and there was literature to be studied that was of great importance. It took a long time to reach that stage. And the people who did it, the people who really broke into the field of giving us the study of the Chinese Buddhist canon were either diplomats or missionaries. There was no such thing at the time that an ordinary person would just start studying and go to China as a student, as we do today and did in my day as well. That was not possible. You had to have a support structure before you could go there. So you were either supported by the diplomatic corps or you were supported by the missionary movement. During that great missionary period, it was the thing to do in the US. Some of the brightest and best became missionaries to China. The YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, that we now think of as mainly a gym and a place to get yourself in shape. It was a major movement taking the brightest and best of some of the colleges in the US, the products of those colleges, to China to be missionaries. So this means, as I look back over it, that not so long ago, of course, being at my age, it doesn't seem so long ago. For those of you who are younger, it must seem very long ago. The Chinese Buddhist canon became an object of study. A copy of it was available. It was being cataloged. It began to be translated. There was a dictionary for the study of it. And we owe all these people I've mentioned a great debt of gratitude that they were the pioneers And they had to invent it. They had to invent the field. They had to invent the methodology. And they had to try to find a way to do their work and to support themselves. So we I guess, have to say thank you to the missionary boards that supported Sothil, Beale. We have to thank the French government for having an enclave in China and for their decision to take the money from the Boxer Rebellion and give it to scholars of Chinese. It's been a long journey just to look at these few little peaks of information on the study of the Chinese Buddhist canon. As you know, there's a lot more to the story that we're all beginning to work with and to know. And in our last 3 lectures, I will try to cover a bit more of it. But I love the stories that I've told you tonight. I feel the gratitude to this group of remarkable individuals. So thank you very much.